Have you ever judged someone by what they were wearing? When a tired, single dad sat in a five-star restaurant waiting for his blind date, the last thing he expected was a woman rushing in wearing stained blue medical scrubs. "I'm sorry. I wore my work uniform," she told him, embarrassed and out of breath. His immediate reaction to her apology changed both of their lives forever. But what he didn't know was that this humble nurse was actually hiding a billion-dollar secret that was about to turn his quiet, structured world completely upside down. Jackson Kensington checked his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. It was 7:45 p.m. The soft, ambient glow of Le Petit Rêve, one of Seattle's most exclusive French restaurants, cast long shadows across the pristine white tablecloth. Around him, couples in bespoke suits and designer evening gowns clinked crystal champagne flutes, their hushed, elegant laughter blending with the live jazz piano playing in the corner. Jackson felt entirely out of place. He adjusted the collar of his charcoal suit, a garment he had bought 5 years ago for a friend's wedding. It was clean and pressed, but the slightly frayed cuffs betrayed his reality. He wasn't a venture capitalist or a tech mogul like the other patrons. He was a 34-year-old mid-level architect, and more importantly, a widowed single father to a fiercely energetic 6-year-old girl named Lucy. "You need to get out there, Dave," his sister Rebecca had told him 2 weeks ago, forcibly taking his phone and setting up a dating profile for him. "It's been 3 years since Sarah passed. Lucy needs a father who isn't running on fumes and leftover chicken nuggets. You need a life." Rebecca had arranged this blind date. All she had told him was the woman's name, Elena, and that she worked in healthcare. Jackson had spent the entire day fighting his nerves. The morning had been a chaotic blur of burnt toast, searching frantically for Lucy's missing left sneaker, and negotiating with his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, to babysit. By the time he had arrived at the restaurant, he was already exhausted, his social battery blinking on empty. And now, he was being stood up. He took a slow sip of his ice water, preparing to ask the waiter for the check so he could go home, relieve Mrs. Higgins, and crawl into bed, just as he raised his hand to signal the maitre d'. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open with a forceful thud. The low hum of conversation in the restaurant faltered for a fraction of a second. Heads turned. Standing in the entryway, looking wildly out of place, was a woman in her early 30s. She wasn't wearing a cocktail dress or designer heels. She was wearing a pair of faded, oversized blue medical scrubs. A stethoscope was still slung carelessly around her neck, and her dark hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun with stray strands clinging to her damp forehead. She wore scuffed white running shoes, and there was a faint, unidentifiable stain near the hem of her scrub top. The maitre d' approached her, his nose slightly elevated, clearly prepared to ask her to use the service entrance or inform her that there was a strict dress code. Before he could speak, she looked around the room, her eyes darting frantically until they landed on Jackson, who was the only man sitting alone. She bypassed the maitre d' with a polite but dismissive, "Excuse me," and practically jogged over to Jackson's table. She stopped in front of him, chest heaving, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of exertion and profound embarrassment. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Jackson noticed the dark circles under her striking hazel eyes that held a mixture of panic and deep exhaustion. "Jackson?" she asked, her voice slightly raspy but melodic. "Elena," he replied, standing up automatically. She looked down at her clothes and then around at the silk and velvet-clad diners side-eyeing her from the adjacent tables. She closed her eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry. I wore my work uniform," the nurse said, her voice dropping to a mortified whisper. There was a multi-car pileup on the I-5 just as my shift was ending. It was chaos. We were understaffed, and I couldn't just leave. By the time I stabilized my last patient and handed off my charts, I realized if I went home to change, I'd be over an hour late and you would have left. So, I just ran. I completely understand if you want to pretend you don't know me and walk out right now. She braced herself. She had been on exactly 3 dates in the last 2 years, and the men, wealthy, pretentious executives her mother had tried to set her up with, had balked at far less. She expected Jackson to look at the stain on her scrubs, look at the judging waiters, and politely excuse himself. Instead, Jackson Kensington's tense shoulders dropped. A warm, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his tired brown eyes, making the faint laugh lines around them crinkle. He didn't look at the other tables. He didn't look at the maitre d' who was hovering nearby with a disapproving scowl. He only looked at her. He stepped around the table and gracefully pulled out the plush velvet chair for her. "Elena, please sit," Jackson said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the middle of the pretentious room. "Don't apologize. You've been spending your evening saving lives and holding people together on what is probably the worst day of their lives. I spent my day arguing with a city planner about the placement of a drainage pipe. You're wearing the most impressive outfit in this entire restaurant. I'm just honored you still showed up." Elena froze, her hand resting on the back of the chair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, searching his face for any trace of sarcasm or hidden condescension. There was none, only quiet respect and a deep, empathetic kindness, a heavy knot in her chest, one she hadn't realized she was carrying, suddenly untangled. She sat down, offering him a grateful, breathtaking smile. "Thank you, Jackson," she said softly as he took his own seat across from her. "You're very welcome," he replied, opening the leather-bound menu. "Now, I don't know about you, but after saving lives, I'd imagine you're starving. The waiter mentioned something about a duck confit, but I'm pretty sure if we ask nicely, they might just have a really good steak and some heavy carbs hidden in the back." Elena laughed, a bright, genuine sound that made a few more heads turn, though this time, neither of them cared. As they looked at the menus, Jackson felt a strange, undeniable spark. He had expected a dull, awkward evening trying to force conversation. Instead, he found himself entirely captivated by the exhausted, beautiful woman sitting across from him in stained blue scrubs. What Jackson couldn't possibly know, as he poured her a glass of sparkling water, was that Elena Harrington was not a regular floor nurse struggling to make ends meet. The scrubs were real, the hospital shift was real, but everything else was a carefully constructed veil. She was the billionaire CEO of Harrington Biomed, the largest medical technology and private hospital conglomerate on the West Coast, and her life was about to collide with his, in a way neither of them could foresee. Dinner at Le Petit Rêve turned out to be the most surprising 2 hours of Jackson's recent life. Despite her initial exhaustion, Elena was electric. Once the adrenaline of her shift began to wear off, replaced by the warmth of this restaurant and a surprisingly robust plate of braised short ribs the chef had whipped up for her, she came alive. She had a sharp, self-deprecating wit that kept Jackson laughing, a deep, chest-rumbling laugh he realized he hadn't experienced in years. "So," Jackson said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table, "you're clearly dedicated to your job. Rebecca told me you work in healthcare, but she was notoriously light on the details. St. Jude's Medical Center, right?" Elena took a sip of her water, a brief, guarded shadow flickering behind her eyes before she smoothed it away. Yes, St. Jude's. It's a demanding environment. I work in the pediatric wing mostly, though tonight I was pulled down to the ER because of the highway accident. Pediatrics. Jackson smiled softly, tracing the rim of his glass. That takes a special kind of heart. Kids are resilient, but seeing them hurt? I don't know if I could handle that every day. It has its moments of heartbreak, Elena admitted, her tone turning quiet and reverent. But kids don't have the cynicism. Adults do. When they heal, they just bounce back. They don't dwell on the pain. They just want to know when they can play again. It keeps me grounded. My boss is incredibly demanding. The administration at the hospital is always focused on metrics, budgets, and operational efficiency. Volunteering, working on the floor with the kids reminds me why we do it all in the first place. She had almost slipped. Volunteering. Elena Harrington held a dual degree in business and nursing from Stanford. When her father, Richard Harrington, suffered a massive stroke 5 years ago, she had been thrust into the CEO chair of the family empire. She spent her days in glass boardrooms, negotiating billion-dollar pharmaceutical patents, restructuring hospital administrations, and dealing with ruthless hedge fund managers. But 3 nights a week, using a variation of her middle name, she put on blue scrubs and worked the floor at one of her own hospitals. It was her secret rebellion. It was the only way she could test her company's medical software in real time, see the actual conditions of her staff, and escape the crushing loneliness of corporate leadership. The men she usually dated were scions of real estate empires or tech founders who spent dinner talking about their stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. They looked at her as a merger, an acquisition. But Jackson wasn't talking about money. "You're a single dad," Elena said gently, steering the conversation away from herself. "Rebecca mentioned you have a daughter. Lucy?" Jackson's entire demeanor shifted. The fatigue in his shoulders vanished, replaced by an unmistakable, radiant pride. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, quickly swiping to a photo. "Lucy," he said, turning the screen toward her. The photo showed a little girl with a mess of curly brown hair, missing her 2 front teeth, covered in mud and holding up a very confused-looking garden frog. She's 6, going on 16. She is the most stubborn, brilliant, exhausting human being on the planet. And I am entirely wrapped around her little finger. Elena smiled, looking at the photo and then at the absolute adoration in Jackson's eyes. "She's beautiful. You must be incredibly proud of her." "I am," Jackson said, his smile softening into something slightly melancholic. He put the phone away. "It's just been the 2 of us for the last 3 years. My wife, Sarah, she passed away from leukemia when Lucy was 3. "Jackson, I am so sorry," Elena whispered, her heart aching at the raw vulnerability in his voice. "Thank you. It was dark for a long time," Jackson admitted, looking down at his hands. You learned to survive. You put one foot in front of the other because a little girl is looking up at you, expecting breakfast and bedtime stories. You don't have the luxury of falling apart. So, you build a new normal. It's not the life I planned. But when she laughs, it's enough. More than enough." Elena stared at him, profoundly moved. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet strength and an ocean of love. She thought about the men in her world who threw tantrums when their private jets were delayed by 30 minutes. And here was this man, a battered but unbroken architect, giving everything he had to a little girl. For the first time in years, Elena felt an intense, undeniable desire to be truly known by someone. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to tell him that she owned the very hospital she claimed to just work at, that she commanded an empire. But a voice in her head stopped her. If you tell him, it changes everything. He'll look at you differently. He'll see the billionaire, not the woman. Let him know you first. When the waiter approached with a discreet leather folder containing the bill, Elena instinctively reached for her purse. Let me split this with you. I know this place is absurdly priced. Jackson shook his head firmly, taking the folder before she could reach it. Absolutely not. You ran here from a trauma ward. The least I can do is buy you dinner. Besides, I promised Rebecca I'd be a gentleman, and I never cross my sister. Elena watched as he placed his debit card onto the silver tray. She knew exactly what a meal at Le Petit Rêve cost. It was easily half of what a mid-level architect might take home in a week, but he did it without hesitation, without making a show of it, maintaining her dignity and his own. They left the restaurant together, stepping out into the cool, damp Seattle air. The streets were glistening from a recent rain shower. My car is parked in the garage a few blocks down, Jackson said, gesturing down the street. Can I walk you to yours, or call you a cab? I'm taking the subway, Elena lied smoothly. In reality, her driver, Thomas, was parked in a discreet black SUV 2 blocks away, waiting to whisk her back to her penthouse. The station is just around the corner. Then I'll walk you to the station, Jackson insisted softly. They walked in comfortable silence, the distance between them closing slightly until their shoulders occasionally brushed. When they reached the illuminated entrance of the subway, they stopped. The glow of the street lamp illuminated the stray strands of hair framing Elena's face. I had a really wonderful time tonight, Jackson, Elena said, realizing with a jolt that it was the most honest thing she had said all week. Despite the company and the terrible jokes, he teased lightly. Because of them, she corrected. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the lapel of his slightly worn suit jacket. I'd love to see you again, if you're willing to risk me showing up in scrubs a second time. I wouldn't have it any other way. Jackson smiled. Good night, Elena. Good night, Jackson. He waited until she descended the steps into the station, making sure she was safe. Only when he was out of sight did Elena slip out through the station's side exit, jogging a block north where the idling SUV waited. She climbed into the plush leather back seat, tossing her stethoscope onto the seat beside her. Home, Ms. Harrington? Her driver, Thomas, asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. Yes, Thomas, she sighed, leaning her head against the cool window, replaying the sound of Jackson's laugh in her mind. Home. The following week felt like a breath of fresh air for Jackson. He and Elena had been texting back and forth daily. Her messages were erratic, sometimes arriving at 3:10 a.m., sometimes at high noon. But they were always witty, thoughtful, and brimming with a warmth that made him smile stupidly at his computer screen. He had told his best friend and co-worker, Arthur, all about her over terrible office coffee. So let me get this straight, Arthur had said, leaning back in his squeaky desk chair. She showed up in dirty scrubs, talked about emergency room trauma over duck confit, and you're completely smitten? Dave, you found a unicorn. A tired, overworked unicorn. But still, don't mess this up. Jackson didn't intend to. He was planning to ask her out for a proper Saturday afternoon coffee, maybe a walk through the botanical gardens. But life, as it often did for a single parent, had other plans. It was Friday night, roughly 11:30 p.m. The rain was lashing against the windows of Jackson's modest two-bedroom townhouse. He was jarred awake by a sound that instantly spiked his adrenaline, the high-pitched, distressed wail of his daughter. He threw off the covers and sprinted down the hall. Lucy was sitting up in bed. Her small face flushed a deep, terrifying crimson. She was crying hysterically, her tiny hands clutching the right side of her head. "Daddy, it hurts. My ear hurts so bad," she sobbed. Jackson touched her forehead and immediately pulled his hand back. She was burning up. He grabbed the digital thermometer from the bathroom. 103.4 degrees. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his chest. A fever that high in a child, combined with the screaming pain. Wasn't something he could just treat with over-the-counter syrup and a cold washcloth. "Okay, sweetie, it's okay. Daddy's got you," he murmured, his voice remarkably steady despite his racing heart. He wrapped her tightly in her favorite fleece dinosaur blanket, shoved his bare feet into his sneakers, grabbed his keys, and carried her out to his beat-up Honda Civic. The drive to St. Jude's Urgent Care Clinic, an offshoot of the main hospital network, was a blur of windshield wipers and frantic prayers. When he carried a whimpering Lucy through the sliding glass doors, the reality of a Friday night urgent care hit him. The waiting room was packed. Flu season had arrived early in Seattle, and the room was a symphony of coughing, crying children, and exhausted parents. He approached the triage desk, feeling a sense of dread. The receptionist looked overwhelmed, typing furiously. "Sign in. Take a number. Current wait time is roughly 3 hours to see a doctor," she said mechanically, not looking up. "3 hours?" Jackson pleaded, holding Lucy closer. "She has a 103 fever and extreme ear pain. Isn't there any way?" "Sir, I'm sorry, but we triage by severity. Please take a seat," the receptionist said firmly. Jackson felt completely helpless. He walked over to a hard plastic chair in the corner, cradling Lucy, rocking her back and forth, whispering soothing words he wasn't sure she could even hear over her own crying. 20 agonizing minutes passed. Lucy's crying had reduced to a miserable, exhausted whimpering. Jackson rested his chin on the top of her head, closing his eyes, feeling like a total failure of a father. "Jackson!" The voice cut through the noise of the waiting room like a clear bell. He snapped his head up, standing a few feet away, holding a clipboard and looking stunned. Was Elena. She was in a different set of scrubs today, navy blue, and her hair was tied back tight. "Elena," Jackson breathed, a wave of immense relief washing over him. She didn't ask questions. She took one look at Lucy's flushed face and Jackson's panicked eyes, and her professional demeanor instantly kicked in. She walked over, placing a cool, gentle hand on Lucy's cheek. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Elena. I'm a friend of your dad's," she cooed softly. "Your ear hurts really bad, doesn't it?" Lucy, normally shy around strangers, just nodded miserably, leaning into her father's chest. Elena stood up, her jaw set. She turned to the triage desk. "Brenda!" she called out, her voice suddenly carrying a weight and authority that Jackson had never heard before. It wasn't the voice of a tired floor nurse. It was the voice of someone who owned the room. "Room 4 is empty. I need a pediatric otoscope and a dose of liquid ibuprofen pulled from the dispensary right now. We're bypassing the queue." The receptionist, Brenda, looked up, about to argue. But the moment her eyes met Elena's, she blanched. "Yes, right away." "Come with me," Elena said to Jackson, leading him down a long, sterile corridor into a quiet examination room. Over the next 30 minutes, Jackson watched Elena work. She was phenomenal. She was gentle, fast, and incredibly reassuring. The on-call pediatrician came in shortly after, taking Elena's notes with a strange, highly deferential nod, confirming a severe middle ear infection. By the time they administered the medication and handed Jackson a prescription for antibiotics, Lucy's fever was already starting to break. She had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on the examination table. "I don't know how to thank you," Jackson whispered, standing near the door as Elena finished wiping down the counter. "You saved us tonight. I was terrified." Elena looked up, her eyes softening. "You don't need to thank me, Jackson. That's what I'm here for. She's going to be just fine. The antibiotics will kick in by tomorrow morning." "When does your shift end?" he asked, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 1:08 a.m. "In about 20 minutes." She smiled tiredly. "I just have to finish some paperwork. Let me buy you a coffee, or a tea, whatever you want," Jackson insisted. "There's a 24-hour drive-through right down the street. I can get Lucy settled in her car seat, run through the drive-through, and meet you in the staff parking lot. Please, it's the absolute least I can do." Elena hesitated. She was supposed to meet her driver, but looking at Jackson's earnest, grateful face, she couldn't say no. "Okay, I park in the reserved lot behind the building. I'll see you in 20 minutes. Jackson carried a sleeping Lucy to the car, securing her in her seat. He drove to the nearby coffee shop, buying 2 large lattes and a blueberry muffin. His heart was full. He felt a deep, profound connection to Elena. Seeing her care for his daughter had cemented something real in his chest. He drove back to the clinic, bypassing the public lot and pulling around to the dimly lit reserved staff parking area in the back. He parked his Honda near a row of bushes, turned off the engine, and grabbed the cardboard tray of coffees. He left the car running with the heat on for Lucy, stepping out into the misty rain. He walked toward the clinic's back exit, waiting in the shadows of the awning. A few minutes later, the heavy metal door swung open. Elena stepped out, looking exhausted. Rubbing the back of her neck, Jackson smiled, stepping forward to call out her name. But the words died in his throat. From the far end of the parking lot, a vehicle approached without headlights. It wasn't a doctor's Mercedes or a nurse's Toyota. It was a massive, impossibly sleek, custom-armored black Maybach. It stopped silently, directly in front of Elena. Before Elena could reach for the handle, the front doors opened. 2 enormous men in tailored black suits stepped out. They moved with military precision, scanning the perimeter of the empty parking lot, their eyes sweeping right past the bushes where Jackson stood frozen. One of the men, wearing a small earpiece, pulled open the heavy rear door of the Maybach. He bowed his head slightly. "Good evening, Ms. Harrington," the man said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet, damp air. "The executive board sent over the finalized documents for the European pharmaceutical merger. They need your signature by 6 a.m. before the markets open in London." Elena stood by the open door. The warmth and softness she had shown in the clinic vanished, replaced by an imposing, icy composure. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She looked like a queen surveying her territory. "Tell the board they will have my signature when I am satisfied with the severance packages for the European factory workers." "Thomas," Elena commanded, her voice sharp and uncompromising. "Not a minute before. If they push back, tell them I'll fire the entire acquisition team on Monday morning." "Yes, ma'am," the man replied, completely unfazed. Elena climbed into the back of the $500,000 vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut with a solid, vault-like thud. The suited men got back into the front, and the Maybach glided out of the parking lot, disappearing into the rainy Seattle night. Jackson stood paralyzed in the shadows, the rain soaking through his jacket. His mind was violently spinning, trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Ms. Harrington?" Executive board? European merger? His grip faltered. The cardboard tray crumpled in his hand, and the 2 hot lattes plummeted to the concrete, exploding into a puddle of brown foam and shattered paper at his feet. The woman he was falling for wasn't a struggling nurse. She was a ghost, playing a role, living a life he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And suddenly, Jackson felt more out of his depth than he ever had in his entire life. Jackson drove home that night in a state of numb disbelief. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers did nothing to drown out the echoing voice in his head. European pharmaceutical merger. Billion-dollar decisions. Ms. Harrington. He tucked Lucy into bed, her breathing now steady and deep thanks to the medication. And then he collapsed onto his worn sofa. He pulled out his phone and opened his browser. It took exactly 1 search of Elena Harrington, Seattle, to shatter whatever illusion he had left. The screen flooded with Forbes articles, Wall Street Journal profiles, and high-res photos of the woman he had eaten short ribs with. Elena Harrington, 32, CEO of Harrington Biomed. Net worth, $4.2 billion. There were photos of her, cutting ribbons at research facilities, standing next to governors, and attending charity galas dripping in diamonds. She wasn't a nurse, she was royalty. And Jackson suddenly felt like a peasant who had accidentally wandered into the palace courtyard. Over the next 4 days, Jackson did the only thing he could think to do. He retreated. When Elena texted on Saturday morning asking how Lucy was feeling, he stared at the message for an hour before typing a brief, sterile reply. Much better. Thanks. Really busy weekend. Talk soon. He didn't talk soon. When she texted on Sunday, he ignored it. When she called on Monday evening, he let it go to voicemail. Across the city, in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Puget Sound, Elena Harrington was experiencing an entirely foreign emotion. Rejection. She sat on her pristine, white Italian leather sofa, staring at her phone. She was accustomed to men who groveled, who bent over backward to accommodate her schedule, who answered her calls on the first ring out of intimidation or greed. Jackson was doing none of those things. He had vanished. "Did I say something wrong?" she muttered, tossing her phone onto the glass coffee table. She replayed their interaction at the clinic 100 times. She had been professional. She had helped Lucy. He had seemed so incredibly grateful, insisting on buying her coffee. And then, nothing. He never showed up in the parking lot. On Tuesday morning, unable to shake the knot in her stomach, Elena made a rare daytime visit to the St. Jude's Urgent Care Clinic. She cornered Brenda at the triage desk. Brenda, last Friday night, the man with the little girl. Did he ever come back with coffee? Brenda looked up, intimidated as always by Elena's daytime corporate attire, a razor-sharp charcoal blazer and silk blouse. "Oh, yes, Ms. Harrington." But he never came inside. Janitorial found 2 busted coffee cups in the VIP parking lot the next morning, right where Thomas usually parks your car. Looked like someone dropped them and just drove off. Elena's heart stopped. Right where Thomas usually parks your car. She closed her eyes as the realization hit her like a physical blow. The Maybach, the security detail, the loud conversation about the European merger. Jackson had been there. He had seen the entire thing from the shadows. He didn't ghost the nurse. He ran from the billionaire. Jackson was hunched over a drafting table at Browning and Associates, rubbing his temples. He was working on a pitch for a new community center, trying to figure out how to stretch a shoestring budget to cover decent plumbing, when his best friend Arthur slid into the chair opposite him. "You look terrible," Arthur noted cheerfully, sipping his coffee. "Did Lucy's fever come back?" "No, Lucy is fine," Jackson grunted, not looking up from his blueprints. "I just haven't slept." Arthur leaned in closer. Is this about the unicorn? Did she dump you? I dumped her. Jackson lied, though it felt like ash in his mouth. Sort of. We just come from different worlds. Artie. It wasn't going to work. Before Arthur could interrogate him further, the heavy glass doors of the architectural firm swung open. The receptionist, a college student named Sarah, stood up so fast she knocked her penholder over. Walking into the modest, slightly messy office was Elena Harrington. She wasn't wearing scrubs, nor was she trying to blend in. She looked every inch the ruthless CEO Jackson had read about. A tailored designer suit, perfect hair, and an aura of command that made the entire office instantly fall silent. Two large men in dark suits, one of them Thomas, stood guard outside the glass doors. She bypassed the receptionist, her sharp eyes scanning the cubicles until they locked onto Jackson. Arthur's jaw dropped. He looked from Elena to Jackson, his eyes practically bugging out of his head. Dave, is that the nurse? Go back to your desk. Arthur. Jackson sighed, feeling a massive headache coming on. Elena stopped at Jackson's drafting table, her presence completely dwarfing the small space. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The warmth was still there in her hazel eyes, but it was mixed with a fierce, unapologetic determination. You owe me 2 lattes, Elena said quietly. Jackson set his pencil down, meeting her gaze evenly. He refused to be intimidated. I think you can afford to buy your own coffee, Ms. Harrington. Elena flinched slightly at the use of her last name. Is there somewhere private we can speak? Jackson hesitated, acutely aware of his co-workers, staring. He stood up and gestured to a small, empty conference room in the back. Elena followed him in, shutting the door behind them and twisting the blinds closed. You saw me, she said immediately, dropping the corporate facade the second they were alone. Her voice was urgent, almost pleading. On Friday night, you saw the car. I saw a lot of things. Elena, Jackson said, crossing his arms, leaning back against the edge of the conference table. I saw a fleet of armored cars. I saw bodyguards. I went home and Googled you. You're not a floor nurse struggling with hospital administration. You are the hospital administration. You own the building. Hell, for all I know, you own the bank that holds the mortgage on my house. I have a nursing degree. I work those shifts because I want to, not because it's a costume. She shot back defensively, though her shoulders slumped. Jackson, please, let me explain. Explain what? That our entire date was a lie. Jackson's voice rose slightly, the hurt finally bleeding through his stoic exterior. I sat there and told you about my dead wife. I told you about how I struggled to pay for Lucy's daycare and keep the lights on. I gave you all my vulnerabilities. And you sat there playing working-class dress-up. You let me pay for dinner when you make my annual salary in the time it takes you to blink. Because you wanted to, Elena cried, stepping forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You treated me like a normal human being. Do you know what happens when men find out who I am? They pitch me startups. They ask for investments. They look at me and they see a bank vault with a heartbeat. I just wanted one night, just one, where someone looked at me the way you did. As just Elena. The raw desperation in Elena's voice caught Jackson off guard. He looked at her, truly looking past the expensive suit and the intimidating power she wielded. Beneath it all, he saw the same exhausted, lonely woman who had rushed into the restaurant in stained scrubs. Elena, I get it. I do, Jackson said, his voice softening, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a heavy sadness. But you don't understand my reality. I am a single father. My entire life is built on a very fragile foundation. If my car breaks down, it's a crisis. If Lucy gets sick, it's a crisis." He pushed off the table, pacing a few steps away. "You live in a world where problems are solved by throwing millions of dollars at them. You have bodyguards. What happens if we date? Do your men in black follow Lucy to kindergarten? Do you buy out the PTA? I can't bring that kind of chaos into my daughter's life. I need stability. I need honesty. I'm looking for a partner, Elena, not a patron, and certainly not a billionaire trying to escape her own reality." Elena stood frozen, the truth of his words stinging more than any corporate defeat she had ever experienced. He wasn't rejecting her wealth. He was protecting his child from the collateral damage of it. It was the most fiercely honorable thing she had ever seen a man do. "I'm not trying to be your patron, Jackson," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And I would never, ever do anything to destabilize Lucy's life." "You already have," Jackson replied gently but firmly. "The deception, even if it was well-intentioned, it means we started on a broken foundation. As an architect, I can tell you right now, you can't build anything lasting on a broken foundation." He walked over to the door and opened it, signaling that the conversation was over. Elena looked at him, her chest tight. She was a woman who never took no for an answer, who negotiated hostile takeovers for sport. But right now, she had zero leverage, because the only currency she had that mattered to him was trust, and she had already spent it. She walked slowly toward the door. As she reached him, she stopped, looking up into his tired, resolute brown eyes. "You're right about the foundation, Jackson," she said softly. "I lied by omission. I was selfish because I wanted to feel normal, and I didn't think about the position it put you in. I am profoundly sorry." She stepped out into the main office, the imposing CEO aura instantly returning as she nodded to her security detail. But before she walked out the glass doors, she turned back to Jackson, who was still standing in the doorway of the conference room. "I fix things for a living, Mr. Kensington," she said, her voice loud enough for the suddenly quiet office to hear, yet meant only for him. "And I don't abandon a project just because the foundation needs to be rebuilt. You'll be hearing from me." With that, Elena Harrington swept out of the office, leaving a stunned Arthur, a highly confused receptionist, and a deeply conflicted Jackson in her wake. Jackson walked back to his drafting table, looking down at the blueprints for the community center. His hands were shaking slightly. He had just turned down one of the most powerful women in the state to protect his quiet life. Yet, as he picked up his pencil, he couldn't deny the terrifying, exhilarating flutter in his chest. Elena wasn't done with him, and heaven help him, he didn't want her to be. The following 3 weeks were the quietest and yet the most agonizing of Jackson Kensington's life. True to his word, he threw himself entirely into his work and his daughter. The community center project for the Beacon Hill neighborhood, a notoriously underserved district in Seattle, had finally been greenlit by the city council. It was a massive undertaking with a microscopic budget, and Jackson was at the construction site every day at dawn, boots deep in mud, arguing with contractors about the price of drywall and copper piping. He didn't hear from Elena. No texts, no calls, no grand gestures. Part of him felt vindicated. He had protected his peace, but a much larger, quieter part of him felt a hollow ache. He found himself looking for a pair of tired hazel eyes in every coffee shop and subway car. It was a crisp Saturday morning. The Seattle sky was a sharp, unforgiving gray, threatening rain. Jackson was at the Beacon Hill site, a half-finished skeleton of timber and concrete, because it was the weekend and he couldn't afford a babysitter. Lucy was with him, sitting safely on a stack of wrapped insulation on the periphery, coloring fiercely in a coloring book while wearing a bright yellow plastic hard hat that slid down over her eyes. "We are short on the electrical conduit, by at least 2,000 feet. Dave," his foreman, Mike, said, pointing a calloused finger at the clipboard. "Supplier says prices went up 12% this quarter. We can't cover it. We either halt construction on the second floor, or we start cutting corners on the community kitchen." Jackson rubbed his face, smearing a streak of dirt across his jaw. "We can't cut the kitchen, Mike. That's the whole point of this place. Let me call around. I'll beg if I have to." As Mike walked away, a vehicle pulled up to the chain-link fence bordering the site. Jackson braced himself, expecting a city inspector. Instead, an ordinary, slightly muddy Subaru Outback parked by the gate. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Elena Harrington. Jackson froze, his heart executing a complicated flip against his ribs. She wasn't wearing a designer suit, nor was she in her blue scrubs. She wore a pair of worn denim jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, and scuffed Timberland boots. Her hair was braided down her back. There were no black SUVs. There was no Thomas. She was completely alone. She walked through the open gate, carrying 2 large cardboard carriers filled with coffees and a thick manila folder tucked under her arm. "Hey, Daddy, look!" Lucy shouted, dropping her crayons. "It's the nice nurse. Hi, Miss Elena." Elena's face instantly softened into a radiant smile. "Hi, Lucy, I like your hard hat. Yellow is definitely your color." She walked over to Jackson, stopping a few feet away, respecting his space. She held out the coffee carriers. "I brought bribes, black, 2 sugars for you, and hot chocolate for the foreman. I remember you saying you liked the terrible stuff from the corner bodega, so I didn't go to Starbucks." Jackson hesitated, staring at her, before slowly taking the carriers. "Elena, what are you doing here? You told me that as an architect. You know you can't build on a broken foundation," Elena said evenly, her hazel eyes locking onto his. "You were right. I lied to you. I hid behind a uniform because I was terrified you'd see the money before you saw me. But you also said you needed stability. You said you didn't want a patron." She held up the manila folder. "I did some research on the Beacon Hill project. Public records. You're trying to build a state-of-the-art community center on a budget that wouldn't cover the landscaping at my corporate headquarters." Jackson's jaw tightened. "If you brought a checkbook to try and buy your way into my good graces, or to stroke your own ego by saving my project, you can turn around right now." I didn't bring a check," Elena shot back, her tone matching his intensity. "I brought this." She handed him the folder. Jackson opened it suspiciously. Inside were dozens of purchase orders, supply chain manifests, and vendor contracts. "Arrington Biomed builds hospitals all over the globe. Jackson," Elena explained, taking a step closer. "We buy raw materials, steel, drywall, copper wiring, electrical conduit, at astronomical volumes. I didn't write you a check, but I did call my procurement department. I had them renegotiate our bulk rates with our suppliers, and I leveraged our corporate buying power to allow Browning and Associates to purchase your materials at our Tier 1 wholesale cost. It cuts your material expenses by exactly 42%. You pay for it out of your own city budget, but now your budget is enough to build the kitchen, the second floor, and the playground." Jackson stared at the spreadsheets. The math was flawless. She hadn't given him a dime. She had simply used her knowledge and her leverage to level the playing field, allowing him to finish his project on his own terms. It was a terrifyingly brilliant, deeply respectful gesture. "Why would you do this?" he asked softly, looking up from the papers. "Because I want you in my life, Jackson Kensington," she said, her voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper, oblivious to the construction noise around them. "And I am willing to lay down every ounce of my empire to prove to you that when I am with you, I am just Elena. No bodyguards, no Maybach, no bullshit, just me." Jackson looked at the woman standing in the mud. He saw the fierce intelligence that ran a billion-dollar company. But he also saw the raw, terrifying hope of a woman who just wanted to be loved for who she was. He slowly closed the folder. A small, reluctant smile broke through his stoic expression. "I really hope you know how to use a hammer, Ms. Harrington, because we're behind schedule, and I don't pay my volunteers." Elena's face broke into a blinding, beautiful grin. "Show me what to do, boss." For the next 4 weeks, they found a rhythm. Elena spent her weekends at the site. She was terrible at hammering nails, but she was ruthlessly efficient at organizing the supply deliveries and managing the chaotic schedules of the subcontractors. She and Jackson ate cheap sandwiches on overturned buckets, laughing until their sides hurt. She painted with Lucy, coming home with more paint in her hair than on the drywall. Jackson was falling in love. The foundation they were building, brick by brick, hour by hour, felt solid, honest, and real. But Jackson had forgotten one crucial detail. You can fire the bodyguards, and you can leave the Maybach in the garage, but you can never truly hide a crown. The storm broke on a Tuesday afternoon. Jackson was at his office when his phone began buzzing incessantly. Texts from Arthur, voicemails from his sister Rebecca, and a flood of notifications from news apps. He frowned, unlocking his screen and opening a link Arthur had sent him. It was an exclusive hit piece on the Daily Insider, a notorious high-traffic digital tabloid that delighted in tearing down the elite. The headline screamed in bold the red font, "The Billionaire's Secret Toy. CEO Elena Harrington abandons European merger to play house with broke single dad." Jackson's blood turned to ice. He scrolled down. There were high-definition, telephoto lens pictures of him and Elena at the construction site. Pictures of them laughing, eating sandwiches. A picture of Elena kissing Jackson's cheek. And worst of all, a picture of Elena carrying Lucy on her shoulders. Lucy's face clearly visible. Her school uniform crest identifiable. The article was vicious. It framed Jackson as a gold-digging opportunist, manipulating a stressed CEO, and framed Elena as an erratic, unstable executive, losing her grip on Harrington Biomed. It detailed Jackson's financial history, the tragic death of his wife, and mocked his modest architectural firm. Jackson didn't care about what they said about him. He cared about the photograph of his daughter. His phone rang in his hand. It was Elena. "Jackson," she said. The moment he answered, her voice was breathless, panicked. "Jackson, listen to me." "They published a picture of my daughter, Elena," Jackson said, his voice deadly quiet, vibrating with a father's protective rage. "Her school uniform is in the photo. Every lunatic on the internet now knows what she looks like and where she goes to school." "I know. Oh God, Jackson, I am so sorry. My security team is already on it. I'm sending Thomas to Lucy's school right now to—" "Do not send your armed guards to my daughter's elementary school," Jackson shouted, standing up from his desk, ignoring the shocked stares of his co-workers. I told you this world of yours would bring chaos. I told you I couldn't have this in her life. Jackson, please, let me fix this." "I am going to get my daughter," Jackson interrupted, his chest heaving. "Do not contact me right now, Elena. Just stay away from us." He hung up, grabbed his coat, and bolted out the door, across town. In the towering glass citadel of Harrington Biomed, Elena stared at her dead phone. Her hands were shaking. The door to her executive suite burst open, and her chief operating officer, Marcus Vance. Wait, let's call him Richard Sterling. No. The prompt said, avoid Sterling. Her chief operating officer, Gregory Pierce, stormed in, followed by 3 members of the executive board. Elena, the stock has dropped 4% in the last hour, Gregory barked, slamming a tablet onto her desk. The Zellner-Fuchs merger is on the verge of collapse. The Europeans think you've lost your mind. They think you're unstable. Elena didn't look at the tablet. She looked out the window at the Seattle skyline, thinking only of the sheer panic in Jackson's voice. We have a PR strategy, one of the board members, an older man named Harrison, said smoothly. We issue a statement that this man was a temporary distraction, a charity case you were consulting for. We distance you entirely. We threaten the tabloid with a defamation suit, and you get on a plane to Zurich tonight to salvage the merger in person. Elena slowly turned around. The panic that had gripped her moments before was gone, replaced by an absolute, terrifying stillness. She looked at the men in her office. She had spent her entire adult life managing their egos, protecting her father's legacy, and sacrificing her own humanity on the altar of share prices and profit margins. She had almost lost Jackson once because of a lie. She was not going to lose him now because of a corporation. No, Elena said softly. Elena, this isn't a debate, Gregory said, condescendingly. Your personal life is bleeding into the shareholders' equity. You are getting on that plane. Elena walked behind her mahogany desk. She didn't sit down. She placed her hands flat on the surface, leaning forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made Harrison take a physical step back. Let me make something abundantly clear to all of you, Elena said, her voice dropping to a lethal octave. I am the majority shareholder of Harrington Biomed. I built the software infrastructure that doubled our valuation in 3 years. I do not take orders from you. You take orders from me. She picked up her desk phone and hit a speed dial button. Sarah, get me the legal department. I want an injunction filed against the Daily Insider within the hour. If they do not scrub the photos of Jackson Kensington and his daughter from their servers, I want you to buy the parent company that hosts their domain and liquidate it by Friday. Burn them to the ground. She hung up and looked back at her stunned executives. Oh, as for the Zellner-Fuchs merger, Elena continued, her voice echoing in the silent room. Let it collapse. I am stepping down as active CEO, effective immediately. Gregory gasped. You can't be serious. You're throwing away a $3 billion deal for a carpenter. He's an architect, Elena corrected, her chin held high. And I'm not throwing it away. I am appointing you, Gregory, as interim CEO. You want the crown so badly, it's yours. Manage the Zurich trip yourself. She bypassed them, grabbing her trench coat from the coat rack. Elena, if you walk out that door for this man, the media will tear you apart. Harrison warned, his voice shaking. You'll be a laughingstock on Wall Street. Elena paused with her hand on the heavy glass door. She looked back at the men who only knew how to measure worth in dollars. Wall Street has my father's legacy, she said fiercely, but they don't get my soul. And they certainly don't get my family. She pushed through the doors and didn't look back. It was 8 p.m. The rain was coming down in relentless sheets, washing the streets of Seattle in a cold, gray blur. Jackson sat on the edge of Lucy's bed, watching her sleep. She was completely oblivious to the chaos that had erupted on the internet. He had picked her up early, turned off his phone, and unplugged the router. He felt completely overwhelmed, a profound sense of failure weighing heavily on his shoulders. He had let his guard down, he had let the fantasy in, and it had blown up in his face. A heavy, deliberate knock, echoed from the front door downstairs. Jackson stiffened. He walked down the narrow staircase of his townhouse, checking the peephole. Standing on his porch, soaked to the bone in the freezing rain, was Elena. There was no umbrella. There was no security detail sweeping the street. Jackson unlocked the door and pulled it open, but he didn't step aside to let her in. "I told you to stay away, Elena," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and heartbreak. "I know," she said, her teeth chattering slightly from the cold. Her hair was plastered to her face, her designer trench coat ruined by the downpour. "I know you did, and I will walk away forever if that is truly what you want. But you need to know that they are gone." "Who is gone?" "The photos," Elena said, looking up at him, water dripping from her eyelashes. "My legal team acquired the hosting rights to the tabloid servers. The photos are permanently deleted. The publication has issued a retraction and an apology. And I have a team of lawyers ensuring that no media outlet will ever publish an unauthorized photo of Lucy again, or they will be sued into non-existence." Jackson stared at her, stunned by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of her resources, but more so by the fierce, protective ferocity in her eyes. "Elena, the fallout from that." "I stepped down, Jackson," she said, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the raw emotion tearing at her throat. "I handed the company over to my COO this afternoon. I gave up the European merger. I walked away." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He reached out, instinctively grabbing her shoulders, pulling her out of the freezing rain and into the warm hallway, shutting the door behind them. "Are you insane?" he whispered, horrified and entirely moved at the same time. "Elena, you built that empire. It's your father's legacy. You can't just throw away your entire life for me, for us. I never asked you to do that." "You asked me for stability," Elena cried, the tears finally mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "You asked me for honesty. You told me that I couldn't build on a broken foundation. Jackson, the company was the broken foundation. It was a wall that was always going to stand between us. The money, the board, the public image, it was always going to bring chaos to your door." She reached up, her cold, wet hands cupping his face. "I don't want the Maybach. I don't want the corner office if it means coming home to an empty penthouse. I want the terrible bodega coffee. I want to argue about drywall prices. I want to read bedtime stories to Lucy. I want this. I want you." Jackson looked at the brilliant, beautiful, terrifyingly powerful woman standing in his modest hallway, dripping water onto his cheap laminate flooring. She had literally sacrificed her kingdom to prove that he was her priority. She hadn't tried to pull him into her chaotic world. She had dismantled her world so she could live in his. All the fear, all the hesitation that Jackson had been holding on to, shattered completely. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and buried his face in her wet hair. He let out a long, shuddering breath, holding her tighter than he had ever held anything. "You're going to ruin my floors, Harrington," he whispered against her neck, his own tears finally falling. Elena let out a wet, choked laugh, her arms wrapping fiercely around his neck. "I know a guy who can get us a great discount on hardwood." Jackson pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "No more running?" "Never again," she promised, her voice steady and certain. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the hesitant, careful kiss of a first date. It was a collision of relief, passion, and absolute certainty. It was the sealing of a foundation that, after being broken down to the studs, was finally, permanently, unshakable. 6 months later, the Beacon Hill Community Center, opened its doors to the public. It was a massive success, praised in the local papers, not just for its architecture, but for its heart. Standing in the back of the crowded gymnasium during the ribbon-cutting ceremony was Jackson, holding Lucy on his shoulders. Beside him stood Elena. She wasn't the CEO of Harrington Biomed anymore. She retained her majority shares and her wealth, but she had taken a permanent seat on the philanthropic board, leaving the daily cutthroat operations to the executives. She wore a simple floral dress, her hand laced tightly through Jackson's. As the mayor cut the ribbon, Jackson leaned down, kissing the top of Elena's head. She leaned into him, smiling brightly, surrounded by the noise, the community, and the chaotic, beautiful, completely ordinary life they had built together. Jackson and Elena's story proves that true love isn't about fitting into someone else's world. It's about being brave enough to build an entirely new world together. Elena had to strip away her titles and wealth to prove her heart, and Jackson had to risk his closely guarded peace to let love back in. They learned that the strongest foundations are built on absolute honesty, sacrifice, and the courage to choose each other when things get tough. If you love this story about sacrifice and second chances, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that real love is worth fighting for. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, dramatic stories every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have given up an empire for love? Let us know.